And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it.
Greetings and welcome to this special edition of the Morningstar Report. I'm your host, Robert Morningstar, and I am honored today to have Mr. Paul Fitzgerald as my guest. If you've been following my work for the last 25 years, 35 years, you know that a central focus of my investigation, my research, is research into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Not just the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the life of John F. Kennedy, which I consider to be one of the most important biographies for every American. For us to understand who we are and where we are, we have to understand the ramifications of the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I'm privileged to have here today as my guest a blood relative of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Mr. Paul Fitzgerald. Paul and I have a common interest in this. It is very deeply seated in our souls and our heritage. To put it quite plainly, we care a lot about John F. Kennedy, his life, his legacy, and the spirit of John F. Kennedy that still remains. It's very much alive for me. He's an ever-living presence in my life and a guide, a mentor. In the course of my investigations of the John F. Kennedy assassination, I discovered many occult aspects to the mystery of his death. And when I say the word mystery, I'm not talking about Sherlock Holmes and figuring out who done it. I'm talking about mystery in the original sense of the word, from the Greek word mysterium. And mysterium is a Greek word that meant and means secret worship of the deity. I want you to grasp that idea for you to understand what Mr. Fitzgerald and I are going to discuss now. I was fascinated to hear Mr. Fitzgerald in his roundtables discussing the heritage of the Fitzgeralds. They are the lineage of the old High Kings of Ireland. And in his telling of that history, I found out that there is a pattern to the sacrifices made by the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys to renew the world, to move history in particular directions. And with those hints, I will now turn to Mr. Fitzgerald and welcome him and thank him for being here with us today. Paul Fitzgerald, I would like to ask you first to just make an opening statement regarding what I've just said, and then we'll get into our mutual investigations and see how we converged on the same discoveries.
Thank you, Robert, for having me on today. It's It's a pleasure to be with you and to share this kind of experience. It's not really a common experience. I mean, even members of my own family, I don't think we're called to try to understand this, and I'm the youngest in my particular family, so that I've always been drawn to it, and so, you know, piece by piece, people would, you know, bit by bit, people would say to me over the years, they say, well, you know, you've got this whole Fitzgerald thing going, you know, you must know this, or you must know that. And, you know, it's like, well, you know, they must have told somebody else because they didn't tell me, you know. But my grandfather's farm, my grandfather had a farm and in Ireland, and the farm is still extant. And he deeded it over to his brother in 1957 because my father had no interest in uprooting himself from New England and going back to Ireland and becoming a farmer. He was a pharmacist and a healer, and he'd been in World War II, and you know, he worked for the drug firm McKesson Robbins, and he decided that he wanted to own it. He wanted to have his own drugstore. After World War II, he got assigned. They sent him to France, and he got assigned as the head of the pharmacy at a military hospital, and he spent a year basically taking care of the wounded. And so he came back and said, I can't act as a salesman any longer. I've got to connect with this. And so he loved France, needless to say. And I remember looking at pictures of him at some of these ancient Cathar ruins and wondering what the heck was this all about, you know, the French medieval castles and things.
Yes.
And Carcassonne was one of the places that he visited with his buddies, and they just told me about this place. He said this whole thing about central and, you know, south central France, and he said it's just amazing.
I was there in Carcassonne. Yeah, and when I moved,
really,
this is going back to ancient Rome. It really is an old Roman city, and as a matter of fact, it's so old that the movie that was playing was actually Ben-Hur. It was just right in keeping. But at the time that I passed through it, I did not know about the Rennes-le-Château and the Priory of Zion and all of that. Now, your father's name was William?
Yes, William. William's a family name.
Yes, I know.
The oldest son in the family was always named William. My oldest brother is named William.
That's
he's
wonderful.
15 years older than me, so we have a generational thing within my own family. So.
Yeah, the reason I mention it, Paul, is that I listened to your roundtables and read some of your manuscript, and I want to start this with your 10-year-old daughter's dream and how she came to you and told you about a dream she had. And if you would begin with that, I think people will understand the thrust, the approach that we are taking. That this is a spiritual investigation revealing spiritual realities that most people who are investigating the life and times of John F. Kennedy are not privy to. So can you begin there and how you began your research into your family history?
Sure. Well, I might preface that by saying that Liz and I, my wife and I, worked together on our documentaries. And back in the 1980, we got the permission from the Afghanistan government that was being supported by the Soviets to get in. Okay, when they invaded in 1979, they expelled the entire Western media. So at that point, what we did was, we put together a proposal for the Afghan government to say, what is this really all about? What is the deeper meaning of this invasion? And I'm sure that, most people don't understand that Afghanistan really plays very heavily into an ancient mystical formula. And people in the Islamic world, Afghanistan was considered to be the core of the belief system. In fact, holy men would name themselves Afghani in order to have that attribute of their personality. At any rate, there was a highly mystical part of it. And I was taken, while I was there in 1981, we did the job for it. We sold the story to CBS News, and I took a crew over with me, and we went for 10 days and got our own look at what was going on inside Afghanistan, and got a completely different view of the workings of geopolitics and international politics. And so I was taken to a place called the Hada Museum. And the Hada Museum had been a Buddhist temple. And you have this thing, a very special form of Buddhism in Afghanistan. It was brought together with, it was a mix of Buddhism and Hellenism that was brought there by Alexander the Great. And so you've got all of these symbols and this cultural thing mix between the Hellenic world and the South Central Asian world. So at any rate, that was part of our experience. And our daughter was growing up as a child during this time period. And so she got to be one day, she woke up, I heard her talking, and there were lots of dreams that were going on and about the experience that I had had. And she woke up one morning and she was making a fuss. And so I got up and I went to the kitchen table for breakfast. And she said, "What was that all about?" I asked her, "What was that all about?" And she said, "I was having a dream." She said, "I thought it was you in the dream, but it turned out to be your father." Now, she'd never met my father. He died in 1968 when I was 17 years old. And so at any rate, so she said, and he was accompanied by this man he had a funny plaid hat. And she said it looked like a golf hat of some kind that sat on the side of his head. And she said, and he had this plaid uniform on. And I was about to ask him, what his name was, but he told me he was 800 years old. So we had started writing screenplays at that point because we figured, the hard news, you could work for a year or 2 years to get 7 minutes on the evening news, which we'd gotten from CBS, and we also worked with Nightline and got, 15 minutes from them. So, but the fact is that we figured, well, if we're going to put all this effort into these stories, we might as well do it for Hollywood and see if we can get a movie made. So at any rate, that was one part of it. So at any rate, so she told us that she had had this experience. So I said to my wife, I said, look, we've been, doing all these efforts, but I said, in looking for stories to talk about these various things that, about Afghanistan and these different ideas between these superpowers and what was going on politically, because we were oriented that way. And so anyway, so I said, I think the 800-year visitation from my father and this man indicates that we're supposed to delve into the Fitzgerald family history. I know that they've been in Ireland for only 800 years, and that is something that I've always wanted to do. I've always felt a connection to the Fitzgeralds in Ireland. So let's make that a focus. Let's do that. So we started to investigate that, and that was in 1992. And so that's when Oliver Stone's movie came out about JFK. We had never focused on JFK as an issue. It seemed everyone else in the world had done that, but not us. So we had our own kind of niche that we had fit into. We almost had exclusive access to Afghanistan for a few years. And so we exploited that to whatever point we could and tried to tell the story, the real story about what was happening in Afghanistan. And so at any rate, when she had the dream, it was like, how is this possible? How is she doing this? And so at any rate, I went and I started getting research books. We went to visit Oliver Stone in 1992, and we told him about the background after we'd seen the movie. And we said, there's this whole background of the Fitzgerald family that's completely unknown. And I think it's really got something to do with, because he'd mentioned the Masonic aspect of it, I think, in the movie, and some of the other secret societies that were involved in the conspiracy. So I said, this is, talk about conspiracy. I said, this goes back 1,000 years. His family lineage and their interaction with the Elizabethans and the war during the Reformation between the Fitzgerald family and in England in the crown, basically, for control of Ireland. And I said, it's been going on. It started in 1169, 1170. And I said it was exactly the same as you've been depicting. So he said, well, look he says, I've already done JFK. So he said, why don't you, I'd be interested in Afghanistan and a story about Afghanistan. So we started to work with him on that. So I started doing research and background stuff on Afghanistan, the origins of the Afghanistan war and the history of Afghanistan. And I wound up getting a book that had been written by an old OSS agent, which was to become the CIA. And he, in the book, were some pictures of the British involvement there in beginning in the 1840s. The British fought three wars with Afghanistan, trying to claim Afghanistan. They'd worked their way up from the south, from India, and had crossed the Hindu Kush.
Yes.
And they had invaded Afghanistan on 3 separate occasions, but they couldn't hold it. And so they backed off over the Hindu Kush. Now, if you look at the map of Afghanistan, and exactly, and the man who would be king is an example. Sean Connery, the lead character, says, basically, he said, if you want to go to Afghanistan, you got to go through. If you want to go to Kafiristan, you've got to go through Afghanistan. Well, I said, how is that possible? Well, it turns out that Kafiristan is basically is what 2/3 of Pakistan is inside what is today Pakistan, and that used to be Afghanistan.
Yes.
So at any rate, in the book was a photograph from the 1840s, black and white, of a man with a funny golf hat on and a plaid uniform. And I put it down on the table at lunch when she came home for lunch. She was in 7th grade, I think. And I said, does this look familiar? She said, oh yeah, that's the guy from my dream. And she said, but he didn't have a beard. He was younger and he didn't have a beard, but that's exactly the uniform he was wearing.
Wow.
So at that point, it was like it was clear. Afghanistan and the research and Oliver Stone, we had connected to something that went deep into the Fitzgerald family history. And this man was somehow connected to it, and he was associated with my father. Now, if it was a visit from my father to me, I had not had any dreams with my father since he died in 1968, and this is 1992. My daughter had never met him. And so as she said, I thought he was you, but then I realized he had red hair. And so that was the whole basis of what we started with. And we realized that we had immersed ourselves in something very intriguing. And I certainly wasn't against, it being mystical in any strange way. But I'd always thought the mystical aspect of it came from my mother's side of the family. My mother could take one look at a situation and she'd tell you exactly what it was and what the person's motives were. It was uncanny.
Yes.
She had that black hair and white skin and blue eyes, deep blue eyes. Mm-hmm. And it was like, so I always thought that the mystical aspect of my own experience with life, came through her. But, I wound up looking at the Fitzgeralds and I'm thinking there's something else going on here with the Fitzgeralds. It's a lot deeper than that. So at any rate, and then of course, one night we were sitting watching television with a friend and she looked at the screen and she said, "That's you." And I looked at it. It was a story about this ancient Irish bog body that had been uncovered in Manchester, England. Yeah. And so at any rate,
well, I think this might be a good moment to share that with the audience, if you'll give me a moment, discussing the discovery of Lindau Man. In the 1980s in England, in a very boggy region of England, they were draining the bog. And in the process, one of the machines struck something, and it turned out to be what you might call a mummy without mummification. The peat bog, because of the acidity and the low oxygen content of the water, had preserved this body. And when the body was extracted and examined, the skin was intact, there was no decay, there was no deterioration. And a lot of forensic work was done on the body. They opened him up and they could actually tell what he had eaten at his last meal. In the process of this investigation, which took several years, they discovered in the contents of the stomach of this person called the Lindau Man, The local people call him Pete Marsh because he was found in a marsh. It's a nice name, Pete Marsh, the Lindau man. They found a certain kind of bread, a scone, that had a special mark on it. And from that item that he had ingested, it was determined that he was a sacrificial victim in a Druid sacrifice. Well, the name of the best book that I've ever come across on the subject is called The Life and Death of a Druid Prince. And they make note that he had red hair, and that the red hair signified a very high standing in the Druid community, that he was regal, he was a prince, or he was a king. So they would sacrifice this high-ranking person and sacrifice him to three gods, Tyrannus, Teutates, and Isus. And Isus is spelled like Jesus without the J. And Tyrannus represented Jupiter, or Zeus. Teutates represented Mars, the god of war. And Isus represented Mercury. So this sacrifice had astronomical significance in offering the sacrifice to these three gods to propitiate them, to offer them a human sacrifice and the soul of the person for their favor, their blessings. And the reason I bring this up is that I've discovered that this is also intimately related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And as we will hear from Mr. Fitzgerald, the ancestors of President Kennedy, the Fitzgerald, the House of Fitzgerald, seems to be part of this pattern of self-sacrifice for the common good. So with that, I'll just say that in my investigations of the assassination of President Kennedy, which was conducted in Dealey Plaza, which was the site of the first Freemason temple in the state of Texas. Dealey Plaza is a monument to Freemasonry. And the course of the road mimics the walk that King Hiram Abiff would take inspecting the Temple of Solomon, which is also an integral part of the story. I would say that Dealey Plaza is a mimicry of the Temple of Solomon. So when President Kennedy's car went north and then turned southeast and down the winding road, Elm Street, and was attacked by at least three assassins, it was mimicking the assassination of Hiram Abiff, who was the architect that worked with King Solomon in building the temple. It also corresponds astronomically with the assassination of Osiris. I discovered that Osiris was killed, according to Egyptian astronomy. Osiris was killed when Mars was in transit in the constellation Scorpio. And furthermore, in investigating Masonic lore and rituals, I found that Manly P. Hall, in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, describes the sacrifice of the Sun King, which is to take place in November when the sun is in Scorpio, to be assailed by three assassins. And a whole ritual is involving the stealing of the body, the hiding of the body, the search for the body. And all of these things were mimicked. The pantomime, a ritual reenactment in the assassination of President Kennedy. Now I would like to turn to Mr. Fitzgerald so he can apprise us of the history of the Fitzgerald and something very similar that occurred 380 years before, practically to the day. So, Mr. Fitzgerald, can you tell us about Earl of Desmond and Gerald Fitzgerald and Elizabethan England and how it relates to this, and the war between these royal bloodlines the Tudors and the Fitzgeralds and the old High Kings of Ireland, and what they were vying for was actually dominance and control of Ireland itself.
Well, that's exactly what the Fitzgeralds were becoming. They were becoming the Norman Hibernian kings of Ireland. And the Normans, as you, I'm sure, well know, that the Normans were the descendants of Rollo, the Viking, and they had settled in northern France, and they had, but they had provinces. They joined with all the peoples that they conquered, including Sicily and southern Italy. And so there were all kinds of involvements with this international group of people who were warriors. They were involved in the Crusades. They were completely connected to the ritual aspects of life, which were very active, and as well as magical aspects of life that were very active back in the 12th and 11th century. That was very much a part of the offerings, the sacrifices that were made. But from the very beginning, the Fitzgeralds, they came under the banner of Strongbow. He was a Welsh marcher lord, and his father, Gilbert de Clare, the de Clare family. And so they were intermarried. There were numerous marriages between cousins and brothers and sisters of the de Clare family and the Fitzgeralds, in order to merge those two families. And ironically, a descendant of Strongbow, of the de Clare family, was George Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush was a descendant of Strongbow. He's related to British royalty through that family. So the original struggle of the Fitzgerald family goes down through the ages between different branches of this kind of ancient hierarchy that was in control 1,000 years ago.
And vying with each other for dominance.
Exactly. So there was an infighting. Now that's what we've been doing with our work since 1992, is we have been investigating and digging as deep as we can into the background of this feud and the lineal descent of some of these people, and how it wound up presenting itself on November 22nd, 1963. Yes. And that's really a significant, that is related to the Knights Templar, it's related to the Knights Hospitaller. A.E. Waite wrote about that in one of his books from 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, about the nature of the revenge and retribution that was part of the 30th degree of Masonry, and that's what was vested in the for revenge for the Pope slaying the Knights Templar. Now we've got the impression that it was the Protestants against the Catholics. It was a Protestants against the Pope, and that JFK represented the Catholics, it represented the Papists. But this issue of power inside Catholicism was a struggle from the very beginning.
Yes.
In terms of the end of the Roman Empire, from the end of the Roman Empire into the creation of the Council of Nicaea of the Catholic faith, it was referred to, the original Catholic Church was referred to as the Roman Imperial Church.
Yes.
So you had this concept of Rome and the imperialism of Rome and the forward progress of Rome that was just a continuation of its program, basically inside the Catholic Church. So this was a very competitive thing, and you had the struggle that then proceeded into the Guelph and Ghibelline Wars, which was a struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. So you had this going on in the first millennium AD, and in terms of inside the hierarchy of Catholicism.
Yes,
so,
and for the audience that doesn't know about the Ghibellines, what you've introduced is a war between imperial powers and bankers. And what I'd like to say in regard to the role of George Bush's bloodline versus the Fitzgeralds and John F. Kennedy, saying is the War of the Roses never ended. And the War of the Roses continues to this day with these two bloodlines at war with each other. And the assassination of President Kennedy was the strike of the British Crown and other interests to topple him and the ascendancy of the Fitzgerald star.
The Fitzgeralds, as it turned out, they had accumulated the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, were Fitzgeralds of Leinster, which is around Dublin, another province, and then Desmond, which is southwestern Ireland. Okay, so they were basically, the Fitzgerald family were directly in control of between a third and a half of the island of Ireland, and so and were paying no taxes whatsoever to the crown. And the crown of Queen Elizabeth was impoverished. Henry VIII had left her an impoverished state. And so she was surrounded by a core of Neoplatonists who believed that through Neoplatonic magic and sorcery, they could acquire a universal empire. We don't talk too much about it today, about the nature of what that meant. But the fact is that John Dee was her astrologer. And a lot of people have been looking back, a lot of academics have been looking back at John Dee's lifetime and his involvement with the creation of some of these concepts. He was a brilliant man. He was probably the founder. He'd be considered to be an astronomer and an astrophysicist today, if he were alive. The fact is that during that time period, there was a great deal of, Rome was very suspicious of anyone who was involved with these ancient studies that the Greeks and Romans had involved themselves with. And so you have this melange of conflicting interests and power struggles, and you still have the use of basically the Elizabethans during the Elizabethan era. They considered mathematics to be a form of magic. You could get burned at the stake for practicing certain kinds of physics. And you know, if the church found out about it. So there was a rebellion within the origins of the scientific community, which was referred to as natural law.
Yes.
And so John Dee and Newton and all of these people came out of that era, and they were looking. It's now referred to by modern academics as cosmopolitics.
Yes. What you're saying basically is that the Catholic Church was adamantly against Hermetic wisdom. And Hermetic wisdom goes back all the way to ancient Egypt. As I mentioned, President Kennedy's assassination occurred astronomically, as you say, the star date. They talk about Star Trek, the star date was identical. It was when Mars was conjunct with Antares in the constellation Scorpio. And the other element that we must be aware of is that Ireland and Scotland are intimately related to Egypt. Scotland gets its name from an Egyptian princess named Scota, who migrated from Egypt. She was the daughter of Akhenaten. And when Akhenaten was overthrown, she left Egypt with two ships. They got windblown, and they were apparently intending to land in Iberia, but they got blown into the Irish Sea and landed in Ireland. And she became the Queen of Ireland, and she was the mother of the first 5 kings of Ireland. And so Scotland is called Scotland because of Scota. And the way I discovered this was just by chance. In 1996, I was channel surfing on cable television at about 2:30 in the morning, and I was going flip, 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 flip. And I hit this stadium that looked like a soccer stadium. All of a sudden, I saw Egyptian chariots coming out and men dressed in Egyptian garb and people marching around with bagpipes and kilts. And the announcer announced that the Egyptian army had sent this regiment to honor Scotland on this anniversary because there was this relationship going back to the time of Ramesses and Akhenaten, and that an Egyptian princess had married an old high chiefs of Scotland and established the royal bloodline. And that was mind-boggling to me. But now it's becoming more common knowledge, but it's intimately related to what we're talking about. especially in the terms of what you're mentioning now, Hermetic wisdom and spiritual magic, and John Dee being an adept practicing Solomonic magic. So take it from there.
Well, some of the things that have been done recently, some of the DNA findings, now that they're getting more and more into DNA, they have discovered that the ancient bodies that they're finding in Ireland were actually have a very specific DNA marker that indicates that that the origin of the DNA is from North Africa, Egypt, which traveled via Italy to get to Ireland.
Yes.
And so what we have too is the fact that when the Roman Empire collapsed, the fact is that a lot of Irish religion was affected directly through the Mediterranean and the west coast of Ireland. So they weren't subjected to the influences. They were, especially at the beginning, at the end of the Roman Empire, the Irish Celtic Christian church, the Celts were converted directly by acolytes that had been in the Middle East, had studied in Istanbul, had studied in the East. So they had come directly through the Mediterranean to the west coast of Ireland, and from Anatolia and from there, so that you had an origin philosophy that did not go through the Roman Empire on its way to Ireland.
Not Roman Catholic, perhaps more Greek Orthodox.
Exactly, very much so. In fact, there's a very strong influence. It's Strongbow, as I mentioned. Strongbow's sister is named Basilia. Now, as I mentioned, there is an Italian aspect to the Fitzgerald family, and it turns out I've got it. I did the Y-DNA thing, and an uncle of mine was doing the genealogy. He was from the State Department, and he wanted to put the family DNA. We still have the farm in Abbeyvale, which is in the southwestern part of the country. And so at any rate, the information came back from Y-DNA, from family tree DNA, and it said basically this is the company that does it for the State Department. So at any rate, so it came back and it said that I belong to a male haplotype that went back to Egypt, not Ireland. It went back to Egypt. But it turns out that that is the haplotype they are now finding in Ireland, which was, as you mentioned, the Scottish connection. Scotia came to Ireland before going to Scotland. And so you had this origin race that had come from the Mediterranean that brought that wisdom and that culture with them and transferred it directly to the Irish population in southwestern Ireland. And so you've got this incredible long-term evolution of the Fitzgerald family going back there. And as soon as they re-arrived in Ireland in 1169 and 1170, they started to reconnect with the Irish through the family of Nesta, and that's where the royal family of the Britons comes in. That's where
May I say that I also have had my DNA analyzed, and Paul, you and I are swimming in the same gene pool.
There you go. Well, we have a lot in common then.
Yes, indeed. It's really great. I personally had a very nebulous self-image, until I had my DNA done, and then it really concretized, and I saw that American is the only thing I can say I am, because so many bloodlines flow through me that I like to say I'm an unhyphenated American. And I'm against that hyphenization of being ethnic first and American second.
Well, exactly. That's what's so important to remember, is that we are really composed of DNA that is of everybody on the planet at some point in our history. If you just look at, we had a wonderful experience back in the 1980s with a black filmmaker. His name was St. Clair Bourne. He was well known. He did a documentary on Spike Lee. And so he did this most amazing thing, and we wrote it up as a screenplay for him, and he was going to do it, and unfortunately he went into for a minor operation and succumbed on the table, died on the table. But what he did was, we will remember him. He took a bunch of activists, 60s activists, from NAACP people. He took all kinds of people from the ghettos, and he brought them to Ireland. And he set up a camera in a room in Ireland, in the hotel, and he put it on and interviewed them every day as they went around in Northern Ireland to see the way they were being treated by the British Army. And it was absolutely astounding, the results that he got. These people, these blacks who'd been on the front lines of the equal rights struggle back in the 1960s and 70s, were just overwhelmed by the way in which they saw black policemen and black English soldiers treating white Catholic Irish the way they had been treated when they were growing up. And they had been so isolated in the ghetto in New York that they couldn't imagine what they were seeing. It was an unreality to them. It was a profound experience.
Yeah.
So
cruelty of England, the cruelty of England to
they managed their empire. We had a friend who went to work for a British corporation back in the 1980s, and he said if they take over the American businesses the way they manage things, he said they are expert at extracting every last ounce of value from whatever they take over.
Yes.
And he said they're brilliant at it, and he said, and very cruel. So that's what's going on today. We're living in that world.
Yes, it is. I sent you something today that was just shocking, that the Irish Parliament has passed a law that every adult is an organ donor, whether they want to be so or not. But that's another subject. It is gory, but we got more gory stories to tell. Let's talk about the Earl Desmond and his fate. And I was shocked that listening to your roundtable that he came so close to marrying Queen Elizabeth and wound up losing his head. Can you tell us about Gerald Fitzgerald? Well,
Gerald was the last Earl of Desmond. And as they say, Desmond was the southwestern part of Ireland. And Desmond was the old name for it, for Munster. And so what he did was he was literally the wealthiest man. He was a young man. His father had done something that displeased Henry VIII to a T. He had gone and he had appealed to Rome for independence. He wanted Rome to grant, and Rome was in a position to do that at the time.
Yes.
And so as a result of that, he had conducted secret negotiations. And so Henry VIII had actually requested that the last Earl of Desmond, that he be educated at the castle in London, that he'd be brought to London and be educated with his own son. And so as a result of that, his father said he was the 14th Earl. The 13th Earl said, no, he'll learn everything he needs to know right here. And so the whole idea is that he was for an independent Ireland. This was something that had gone on from the very beginning in 1169 and 1170, from the original invasion under Henry II. Henry II was furious that the Fitzgeralds and Strongbow had established themselves very easily in Ireland. And there was a big study that was done at Trinity College in Dublin about 6 or 7 years ago, where they dug into the background and the available historical things that are around still of it. And they tried to figure out what was the issue regarding the Fitzgeralds and why was the family name still so prominent. So what happened was that the Fitzgerald family and the Earls of Desmond, there were two earldoms in the Fitzgerald family, the Dukes of Leinster and the Earls of Desmond. And Dukes of Leinster made a deal. They cut a deal. A number of them were killed. They were hauled off to the Tower. They were disemboweled. They were hanged. And so they wiped out the leadership. And eventually someone came over from the Leinster Fitzgeralds and said, signed on with the crown. But the Desmond Fitzgeralds fought to the bitter end to remain independent. And so the last Earl of Desmond basically was handed a war. He was arrested, he was put in the Tower, he spent 10, 12 years in the Tower, and as a 40-year-old. And so his life was basically taken from him, but they couldn't kill him. That was the one thing that London couldn't do. And so what he was he was left to kind of figure out the situation on his own. They finally said there was such turmoil in Ireland over what was happening at that point in time. And so this was the 16th century. This was the 1580s. And so they had him in prison. They said, finally, we're going to let you go back. And so he went back. They believed that he would finally get the message and sign on with London. And in turn, he didn't. He refused. And so there was a war, the Desmond War, and he was finally defeated and beheaded. And the irony is that he was beheaded on a very specific date. He was beheaded on what turns out to be November 22nd, 1583, 380 years to the day. Exactly. Now, you've got this conflict, of course, with the calendar, so it's deceptive. You've got the Julian calendar gets converted the very same year to the Gregorian calendar. So there's a different date assigned to his death. But when you add the days under the Gregorian calendar that we use today, it's November 22nd. So this is, once again, you've got the corresponding dates. You've got John Dee, who is putting together the horoscopes for these things. He's using what is now referred to as cosmopolitics. He's looking at the skies, he's looking at the heavens, and he's saying that these are making prophecies based on the alignment of these various things, these various planets and the conjunction of various things. And that's what you pointed out specifically was happening at Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963.
Well, Mr. Fitzgerald, I want to thank you. We've done an hour. I think it's a great introduction, and I hope that we can continue. We don't want to overwhelm the audience, but I think that we've laid the groundwork for a comprehensive understanding of what we're dealing with and what was at play that day, November 22nd, 1963, November 22nd, 1583, and November 22nd, 1307, when, according to John J. Robinson, the historian of the Scottish Rite Freemasons, the Templars were burned at the stake and began this, I would have to say, an internecine war between royal bloodlines that is going on right to this day. So I want to thank you very much. I'm honored to have this opportunity. I call it the torrent of truth. What I do on my program, I call it the torrent of truth. And today, we have washed clean a lot of dirty history by telling people the facts that have been hidden from them, occulted from them by the powers that be. And so on that note, we'll leave it here. And again, thank you very much, Paul Fitzgerald, for being on the Morningstar Report.
Thank you, Robert. It was a pleasure.
On the 1st of August 1984, part of a human leg was exhumed in a peat shredding mill in Cheshire. In the days which followed, the police confirmed it wasn't a recent death, and it became very clear that despite the damage done by the machinery, this body was very well preserved and very old. Local and national press soon jumped on the story, affectionately naming him Pete Marsh, having been found in a peat bog. Soon, national bodies were interested, and the British Museum brought him in to perform a plethora of tests on the body. The test revealed an extremely violent end to Pete's life. He had a hole in his skull where something had pierced into the brain. He had been beaten, garroted, and had a knife slit his throat sometime in the 1st century AD. Like most people, there was even an accurate reconstruction of his face in life produced. The question was, what had happened to him? Almost immediately, people spoke of human sacrifice, and the idea of the wild Iron Age people killing a man and throwing him into the bog to placate their gods was extremely attractive. Another theory was that he was simply a criminal and had been executed summarily. However, why on earth was this gentleman so well groomed and so well fed and generally looked after if he was on death row? Others suggested it is actually regicide, the ritual killing of a leader, possibly in response to something like a bad harvest. Whatever the answer, it must take into account the sheer number of bog bodies found across Europe. There are more than 1,800 bog bodies currently known about. In other words, until we have a clearer idea of the circumstances surrounding their death, bog bodies will always be a mystery.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.